Before we begin, let's walk through our webinar platform together. Each of the buttons at the bottom of your screen relate to sections in the On24 console. The speaker view is where you will see our presenters throughout the webinar. The slide view is where you'll see the accompanying slides. Our poll questions will also appear in the slide area. Be sure to click directly on the slide to answer poll questions throughout the webinar. You can resize these widgets for a larger or smaller view. You may follow along also with a PDF version of the slides that can be found in the related content widget. The CPE criteria section details the requirements you must meet to receive full credit for CPE in this session. To obtain CPE, you must do two things. First, be on the live webinar for at least 50 minutes, and second, respond to 3 of the 4 polling questions that will appear throughout the presentation. You can track your viewing progress in the Earn CPE widget on your screen throughout the webinar. By registering for today's event, you will automatically receive an email after 24 hours with a link to download the slides and a link to view the recording. Additionally, if you meet all the criteria and qualify for CPE, a link to your CPE certificate will be in that email as well. Please remember that it does take 24 hours for that email to be automatically generated, so look for it sometime tomorrow afternoon. For CPE-related questions, please reach out to cpe@yptc.com. In the related content section, you can access any accompanying materials for this webinar. This includes a PDF copy of the slides and many times will often include related resources. Reactions from our audience throughout the webinar will float along the console screen. Use the Q&A section to ask questions directly to our speakers throughout the presentation. In the speaker bio section, you can find more about our presenters, including their contact information. If you need technical assistance, please use the help button below. Many times, technical issues can be resolved by opening the webinar in Google Chrome or refreshing your browser. Finally, the evaluation button contains our post-webinar evaluation survey. Here is where you can share your commentary and feedback on the presentation. We hope you enjoy our free webinar. Now, let's get into today's topic. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Demystifying Federal Funding, Nonprofit Questions Answered. This is the first of YPTC's series aimed to deliver real-time insights and practical guidance for federal funding and the nonprofit sector. Before we get into our discussion, I would love to introduce who we and YPTC are. Your Part-Time Controller, or YPTC for short, is a professional services firm that specializes in nonprofit financial management with more than 30 years of nonprofit expertise. Our services include accounting, reporting, data viz, and best practices, just to name a few. Our network of almost 800 staff have seen it all, helping close to 2,000 clients throughout the United States, as well as clients in several other countries. My name is Carly McIntyre, and I will be moderating today's session. I support YPTC's training department, aiding in the development of key internal and external training. And one of my favorite parts about my job is having the opportunity to collaborate on a wide range of topics with our experts around the country. So I'm very pleased to pass it over to our expert panels today to join us for today's conversation. So Derek and Hatsie, we're so grateful to have you. Please tell the listeners a little bit about yourselves.
Thanks, Carly, and welcome everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your morning or afternoon, depending on where you're coming in from. We're going to be focusing today on federal funding, but we both work with funding from all levels of government. I'm Hatsie Cutshaw, and I'm the director of YPTC's Government Awards Management Department. I've worked with YPTC for more than 13 years, and I've had the privilege of leading teams in DC, Phoenix, and most recently New England. Prior to coming to YPTC, I was the CFO for 2 largely federally funded nonprofits, where I learned the rules that govern federal awards long before there was such a thing as uniform guidance. I've established and maintained systems to ensure organizations can meet the reporting requirements on their awards. I've helped many organizations apply for and administer negotiated indirect cost rate agreements, and I'm excited to be here today to share my experience and insights and hopefully give you some ideas for managing your organization through these uncertain times.
Hello, I'm Derek Dreyer. I lead the Government Funding Department at YPTC. Just as HATC helps our clients manage and report on existing grants, my role is to help our clients find and apply for institutional funding, including both government and foundation grants. I have nearly 25 years of experience as executive director of a nonprofit myself, so I'm a firm believer in the value of mission-based organizations. I was a frequent applicant for institutional funding of all kinds during my term as director, and I also served as a peer reviewer for multiple funders during that period. And not least, I serve on boards and committees for several nonprofits, like many of you here today, I'm sure. So suffice it to say, I understand the needs and issues you face, but also the values you offer. I look forward to sharing my knowledge and experience with you today.
Thank you, Hatsie and Derek, and we definitely look forward to hearing more about what you have to share. So this slide is just a little takeaway for you all in regards to the CPE information, as well as how to obtain CPE credit. So remember that the slides are available for download in the related content widget. And if you do have any questions on CPE, please reach out to cpe@yptc.com after today's session. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar is the first of our content series, Managing Through Uncertainty, which will be a collection of webinars, blogs, and other content in direct response to current events. That said, today's session is bringing it back to the basics. We will be pulling back the veil, so to speak, on a very impactful yet widely misunderstood aspect of American society, the nonprofit sector. The first half of our conversation will explain how and why the government makes awards to nonprofits. Then in the second half, we'll shift focus to explaining how the stewardship of those resources is a lot of work, even in the best of times, which I'm sure many of you listening understand that. Along the way, our experts will be offering strategies and tips for doing so amid certain uncertainty. It's likely that a lot of you are on for clarity around that. I also want to say that I was so happy to see all the questions come in from you during the registration process. In fact, we had over 175 questions come in. So thank you so much for reaching out and being engaged on this important topic. Due to the high volume, unfortunately, we will not be able to address all questions here. However, we've done our best to ensure that the key themes have been addressed in our conversation. We'll also try and answer questions live from the Q&A. So drop a question in the Q&A widget, and if we're still unable to address it, stay tuned for future content as well as other resources that will be created. And of course, you can always reach out to either YPTC or federal funding at YPTC, and those resources are provided in the slide deck as well. Finally, to be very clear on what we will not be doing, we will not be speculating or providing legal advice. As with life in general, we are not able to predict the future. However, Derek and Hatsie are equipped with much knowledge and wisdom, and I really hope that you find this conversation to be engaging and informative. So let's get into it. But first, our first poll of the session. So please click directly on your slide area to answer the poll, and you may need to scroll down to see all of the options. But does your organization receive federal, state, or local agency funding? And Derek and Hatsie, as the answers are coming in for this poll, what's maybe one thing that you hope to really convey during this session today?
So, yeah, Carly, I'm hoping everybody leaves with a little more understanding of how our federal appropriations system works. It's kind of a look back to the civics class we all had in 7th grade, maybe haven't thought about since. And I want to share why the government makes awards to nonprofit. The spoiler is it's because the government wants to reward organizations that can solve a problem in society or can improve society. Nonprofits can do that particularly well and efficiently because their mission focus allows them to be nimble. Nonprofits can have both immediate and long-lasting impact including in a lot of areas where the government just can't get involved or doesn't want to get involved.
And I hope to convey just how rigorous the checks and balances are on nonprofits, especially when they do receive federal funding. We all know it's a privilege for an organization to operate as a nonprofit, but in exchange for that privilege, nonprofits must operate with a lot of oversight and public scrutiny while they deliver those crucial services to our communities. There are reports to federal, state, and local governments and more that we'll be talking about later in the program.
Thank you both. And a quick reminder to our audience, if you're experiencing technical issues or the poll is not appearing, go ahead and refresh your web browser. We also find that better functionality happens in Google Chrome. So if you want to come back into the webinar in Google Chrome, refresh your web browser. And also, we have 3 more poll questions, so please know that you'll have other chances to get that poll. But we are going to advance now, and it looks like the vast majority are yes, receiving federal, state, or local agency funding. So there's going to be a lot of applicable information for those folks on today's session. So we did not name this section Understanding the Basics without wanting to start at the very fundamental level. Derek, as you mentioned in your little conveyance, please bring us back to Elementary Civics 101. How does the government acquire the money to spend?
Well, to channel an author I've always liked, Lewis Carroll, let us begin at the beginning. You can't spend money if you don't have any. So, Carly, I can give you a one-word answer to your question. The main source of money for the federal government, and by the way, when I use the word government today, I mean federal government, and I mean United States government. I don't mean state or local governments. It's taxes. Income taxes paid by individuals make up almost half of the roughly $5 trillion expected in federal revenues in 2025, and payroll taxes are not far behind. We have a nice visual on the next slide, actually. So here's a great chart from the Tax Policy Center that illustrates the changing percentages of federal revenue sources over the last 70-odd years. It buttresses the point I made just a moment ago that taxes comprise the lion's share of federal revenues. Individuals, that's you, that's us, are bearing the largest burden. And again, the total revenue projection for 2025 is about $5 trillion.
It's fascinating to see those numbers, especially in the visual like that. And, you know, we've discussed how the government collects revenue, but let's kind of address how that money gets spent. Who decides what goes into the federal budget?
Well, Carly, it all starts with the executive branch, namely the president, and he, or someday she, will work with the other executive agencies to develop what gets proposed in the budget. It's all coordinated largely by the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, which is kind of a liaison among all the executive agencies, as well as a referee sometimes. And we'll mention this later too. OMB is actually the agency that sets the rules by which we have to comply if we do receive federal money. So once the president puts together that budget, he sends it on to Congress, excuse me. And it is Congress that decides what to accept in that budget, what to change, what to possibly eliminate. But keep in mind, they're only working with maybe just under a third of total government spending, because the rest of it, the majority, is mandatory appropriations, such as the largest being Social Security benefits, Medicare and Medicaid, and there's some other mandatory programs. So they're working with a relatively small piece of what is the total annual U.S. budget. Once they decide what to approve, what to appropriate, it goes back to the executive branch to implement the programs and figure out how to do the work that it's going to take to carry out the programs that Congress has approved. Once again, OMB is the overseer. They make sure that everything's working as it should and serves as a resource for the other agencies. You can take a look on usaspending.gov to see which federal agencies are providing the most money out to nonprofits. We have a fun fact in fiscal year 2023, which ran from October of 22 to September 23. 66,000 grants were made to nonprofits, and they added up to 46 billion. So we're not talking about a tiny piece of the U.S. economy. Nonprofits make up a really important part of the work that happens in our communities. I'm going to ask Derek to offer a good example he came up with while we were preparing for the program that illustrates how the budgeting process works in a way that might be a little more accessible.
Thanks, Hatsy. Every time I hear you explain how the appropriations process works, developing the budget, reconciliation, and so forth, I'm reminded of the days when I was an executive director and I had a big idea for the coming year's budget, and I would gather staff and board committees and try to garner support around it, and I'd present a draft to the finance committee. And darned if they didn't always come back and say, well, you can't have that, but how about this? And you'd have a series of back and forth meetings where you'd bring in various committee members, team members, and eventually you would agree on a total budget. And as all of us know in the nonprofit world, you're going to have a budget that's balanced. You have to have money to spend money. I've noticed many of you said in the comments, hey, you forgot debt finance. You're right. Federal government has a lot of debt. There's a $2 trillion deficit in this year's budget. So we're aware that they're playing that way, but on the nonprofit side, we generally can't do that. So I've just been reminded of that whole back and forth, and it's something that I think all of us can relate to, at least at a smaller scale.
Mm-hmm. And I want to speak to another piece of not only what I garnered through the registration questions, but something I'm seeing alluded to in the Q&A section so far as well is clarity on recent executive orders, right? That might be a reason why many people joined today. So this kind of begs the question, according to the process that Hatsy so clearly outlined, can a presidential administration stop federal funding?
Well, Carly, as with all things federal, it's complicated. The Constitution grants Congress the power of the purse. As we discussed, they're the ones that decide what's going to get spent, how much, and by whom. And presidents historically have had a power that's called impoundment, with which they can refuse to spend what Congress has appropriated. But back in the early 70s, after President Nixon exercised that power, and he certainly wasn't the first, this goes back to the beginning of our Constitution in our country, Congress afterwards passed what is called the Budget and Impoundment Control Act, and that sets limits on how long the president can hold funds and closed up some other loopholes. So we're not constitutional scholars or lawyers by any means, but there is some precedent for what's going on. Certainly executive orders are not unique to this president, but as we've all seen, there is certainly a lot of room for debate. Mm-hmm. Derek, other insights I failed to mention?
I think you've covered the waterfront. A lot of folks are asking what our take is on whether or not the administration is following rulings by the judiciary, if they're playing fair with Congress. And as you noted, Hatsy, we're not scholars of constitutional law, so we can't really opine on that. But we're certainly aware that there's a debate out there, and we're following that debate with great interest. But we've sketched out the way it generally is meant to happen.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for walking us all so clearly through that. I want to go back to something that was mentioned kind of before that discussion. So once the money has been appropriated in the budget, right, what are the different modalities of organizations such as states, localities, tribes, nonprofits, right, or even individuals receiving that money?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Carly. There are lots of different ways to do business with the federal government. And the slide here shows some of the basic types. It's certainly not exhaustive. First, we have grants, something familiar to many of you based on the responses to the first poll question. When you're talking about a grant, you have a federal agency making an award that will allow a nonprofit, or maybe I should say require a nonprofit, because there are strict rules around this, to expend monies in order to do something that the government wants to have done for the benefit of the people. It's supposed to be something that will fix a problem in society, improve society, as I said earlier. There are several different types of grants. There are competitive ones, which are known as discretionary. There are earmarks, which we often know as pork, although I will say they're not always bad. It's just the way they happen. And then there are formula grants. Those are grants that are made to states and cities and tribal governments. Beyond grants, we also have cooperative agreements. Probably many of our listeners today have entered into cooperative agreements, and you know very well that what happens there is the federal government has a say or a vote in basically every major decision. It's an ongoing, active partnership throughout the project. And finally, you have contracts where the federal government is basically hiring a nonprofit to deliver goods or services it needs. So those are the basics.
Thank you for that.
So I want to share another interesting statistic. We talked about the size of the budget and how appropriations work. And many of you have been commenting about some of the stories you're reading on the internet of late. And I saw a statistic that's been bandied about a lot of late that bothered me. Apparently, only 5% of Americans think they've ever engaged with a nonprofit of any kind. And that belief may be correct, but the assertion is patently wrong. Many Americans are born in hospitals that are part of nonprofit networks. Many Americans attend preschool programs that are mounted by nonprofits or nonprofit-run preschools. And then they go on to participate in various school enrichment programs in the K through 12 years that are offered by nonprofits. And then they're likely to attend a nonprofit college. And after that, they'll enjoy lifelong engagement with nonprofits of many kinds that might include theaters, museums, parks, neighborhood clubs, sports teams, and more. We've listed a few of the types here on this slide, but again, these are not exhaustive at all. Another statistic I have for you, there are 1.85 million nonprofits in the US. And again, they exist to do the work the government wants to have done and needs to have done, but can't do by itself or doesn't want to do. There are also nearly 13 million people who work for nonprofits, and there are 64 million people who serve as board members or volunteers for nonprofits. That's a lot of people who value and serve nonprofits, and think of the millions more that benefit from nonprofits. So again, I'm here to say nonprofits and everyone associated with them should be celebrated for their commitment to impactful and mission-based work. And a lot of us wonder, well, what can I do in these difficult times when people are saying things that aren't true or aren't flattering about nonprofits? Now, more than ever, don't hide your light under a basket. Talk about the good work you do. Talk about the impact you have on every sector, every region, and every person, no matter where they fall on the political spectrum.
Such wonderful advice, Derek. Thank you for kind of illuminating all of those figures for us. And I see so much engagement from the audience. Obviously, they know exactly what you're speaking to here.
Right. There are so many more examples. I picked a few, and thank you, listeners, for offering so many more. They're out there, and you should be proud of them. You should celebrate and share them.
Absolutely. All right, so before we kind of shift gear just a little bit, we are going to have our second poll question of the day. So again, click directly on the slide area and respond. What is the biggest challenge your organization faces with federal funding? Is it understanding the eligibility and application requirements, maybe navigating the compliance, which we're going to speak more into that in just a few minutes? Is it managing federal funds effectively? Also, we're going to touch on that later. And then is it, determining whether or not to apply amid the uncertainty? So Derek and Hattie, are there any kind of surprising things that you've noticed in your work with clients and what they're facing with federal funding?
Well, it's not
Carly. Oh. I'm sorry, go ahead, Hattie.
Well, I was just going to say it's not surprising, but the bravery that we're seeing out there from groups that are facing so much uncertainty, and we have seen some groups that have had to fold as a result of what's changing right now, and our hearts go out to them because it's very, very troubling.
And I was just going to reiterate my earlier point to share the good news of what you do and the impact you have. I know many nonprofits are not interested in wading into political waters, and I totally get that. I support that. But there's nothing political about sharing statistics about the impact you're having, sharing news of the good work you're doing, because most Americans appreciate and want the services and the goods you're offering.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right.
I think the thing that surprised me speaking with some clients recently, there were a few who seemed somehow hesitant to approach other funders in face of federal funding difficulty. They thought, well, I shouldn't get in line for foundation funders because the services I offer aren't life-saving. I should let someone else do it. And I realized that foundations cannot carry the totality of giving that the federal government normally offers. Hattie gave you that extraordinary figure, $46 billion in FY23. But you shouldn't be ashamed to talk about your good work and ask for support. Many nonprofits are, in a way, offering life-saving services, even if they're not offering immediate medical relief or something like that. They're doing things that enrich and make life more valuable.
Absolutely. It's a necessary vein of the workings of our society. So let's see where people are having the biggest challenges. It looks like a lot of navigating compliance and reporting obligations. So yes, we have a lot of resources around that, and hopefully you'll find a little bit of a clarity by the end of today's session as well.
Yeah, I think Hattie's going to talk to that in a few minutes. We know that's a heavy lift. It always has been. And so assertions that it's easy to get federal money, you don't have to do anything, those are wrong too. Let me just spend a quick minute, though, talking about how to find and apply for federal grants or awards or contracts. I'm going to be very, very brief because, well, again, some of you may decide you'd rather not apply for funding amid the ongoing uncertainty, but the bigger reason I can be brief today is because Hattie and I have offered a number of programs over the last few years that do a really deep dive into finding and applying for federal grants, all the various websites and systems. We've even had a webinar lately where we talked about recent updates to the grants.gov website that lists all the federal grants and contracts, recent changes to uniform guidance that govern grants, and all of these webinars and other resources are always available free on our website. You'll find links to those at the end of this presentation. So again, today, super brief, but when you're looking to find and secure a federal award of some sort, there's a lot of common sense involved. First, you can't apply if you're not registered. So take care of that on the various free government websites, sam.gov, grants.gov, login.gov. Once you're registered, you can start searching for grants. You want to stick to grants that are relevant to the mission of your nonprofit. You need to make a compelling case that you're a logical and good applicant. And then you want to read everything carefully. Make sure you're not just eligible, but you can meet all the requirements of the grant, the timetables, the goals, the reporting, and other things. Then as you're working on the application, leave yourself a lot of time. These are long applications. They ask for a lot of information, and you may have internal review or approvals processes you need to go through as well. And finally, when you're getting ready to submit, make sure you've provided all the information they've asked for. You've answered every question, you've supplied every document, but don't give them anything extra. They want nothing more and nothing less than what they've requested. So those are my tips, super brief, but again, lots more available in greater depth on our website.
Thank you for that, Derek. I feel like you condensed a very lengthy process down into a very easy to manage kind of where do I start, and ensuring that the importance of really crossing your T's and dotting your I's when it comes to this. So let's kind of move forward and as we've mentioned, speak to the managing funds and compliance, right? So, and he mentioned this as well, but last April, we did a webinar called Federal Funding Blueprint. That's a more detailed walkthrough of the finding and applying. And as he mentioned, as well as the links to those sessions can be found at the last page of this PDF. That's in the related content widget. So with that, we've covered the basics of the origination of federal funds, but securing the funding, as Derek mentioned, is just the first step. Once awarded, managing these funds properly becomes critical, not only to maintain compliance, but also to uphold the trust that has been placed in your organization. So federal grants come with detailed oversights, reporting obligations, expectations for accountability. So in this next section, we'll be addressing questions related to key compliance requirements and how to navigate federal oversight effectively. And Hatsi is going to really provide a lot of insight here. So is it easy to keep or renew federal funding? As we're kind of showing, no, right? But what are some of the key compliance requirements nonprofits need to be aware of? Hatsi?
Thanks, Carly. As Derek has outlined, it's not easy to get federal funding. It takes a lot of time and thought. And then once it's awarded to you, there's a lot of work that goes into maintaining it and keeping it and complying with the rules set by the government. Chief among those rules for those that receive grants or cooperative agreements is what is called uniform guidance, which is a comprehensive set of rules established by the Office of Management and Budget. It's housed in the Code of Federal Regulations. If you're that kind, if you would like to look it up, search on 2 CFR 200, and that will get you started on what is thousands of pages of guidance that relates to all the agencies in the executive branch. So OMB sets the standards, and then each agency must comply with that. Sometimes they adapt it a little bit to suit their own purposes. Those rules cover everything from definitions to what kind of costs are allowable on federal awards, audit requirements, indirect costs, whatever might go into working with federal money. So also, if you receive a contract similar to uniform guidance, there is guidance called FAR, or Federal Acquisition Regulations. It's very similar in many ways. For the most part, what we're talking about here today relates to grants and cooperative agreements governed by uniform guidance. And that guidance, as well as the award documents themselves, will outline the reporting that's required. You don't just get the money and head off on your merry way. You must check in with the federal agency periodically, sometimes quarterly, sometimes twice a year, and and tell them, what are we doing with the money that you gave us? Both programmatically, are we feeding people? Are we building a new water plant? What was it that you proposed when you applied for the federal money? And there are also financial reports required periodically, just to ensure that all expenses are allowable. There's a lot of monitoring that goes into making sure that nonprofits and other award recipients are doing what they should with the money. There are financial and compliance audits required. If an organization spends $1 million or more in a fiscal year, they're required to have what's called a single audit, which is a combination of financial and compliance auditing. It's much more rigorous than what you may think of as a conventional financial audit, if you can believe it. And on top of all that reporting that usually is in written form, federal agency program officers will come out and take a look at what you're doing with the money. Can they see the water treatment plant that you promised to build with that money? There may also be desk audits that tend to be largely financial, but they may also drill into some of the programmatic work that you've done with the work. And keep in mind that these rules, this guidance, applies to organizations whether they receive money directly from the federal government as a prime recipient, to throw out a little bit of terminology, or they're getting the money through the state or a local government that is essentially funneling federal money through to them as a subrecipient. One thing I did not include on this slide, because it's not unique to organizations that receive federal money, but the 990, Form 990 is just another way the feds, as well as the general public, can hold nonprofits accountable for the money they spend and the work that they do. It's a way of, you can look up a Form 990 for an organization on guidestar.org. They're in the process of changing their name to Candid, but you can establish a free profile there and look up their 990s, see what's going on. So since that tool is open to the public, use it. You can use it for marketing purposes. There is a lot of narrative information on the 990 where you can talk about not only what you're doing in your programs, but as well as how you might be spending federal money. So don't overlook, don't let your auditors write the narrative on your 990. Use that as an opportunity to talk about the good work you're doing.
Hatsie, I have to snicker as I hear you saying that. I teach nonprofit governance, and one of the things I like to emphasize is that the 990 is just what you said it is. It's a marketing tool as well as a federal reporting tool. There's that big text box on the first page that asks you what activities you engage in. And how many times have I seen an auditor write, the charity exists to meet charitable purposes? Or maybe they're just reusing something that's been in that box since 1952 when the charity was founded. That's a place to talk about the important work that you're doing and the impact you're having. There's not enough room for a novel, but there's room to talk about what makes your work so interesting, what makes your mission unique, or even if it's not unique, what makes it important. Because of the fact that that document is available everywhere to everyone, many charities put it on their own website. You can look it up on Candid, formerly GuideStar. You can look it on ProPublica. You can ask the IRS to send you one. You can find them everywhere. Potential donors are now doing research and due diligence homework into organizations before they consider making gifts. And it's not even just those $1 million gifts you're reading about from Mackenzie Scott. It might be someone who's considering making a $500 gift. They want to know what the charity does, how it spends its money, what policies it has in place. And the 990 gives you information about all of those things. So take a moment to tell your story.
Agreed. Thank you. So, most common compliance pitfalls. From In our world, since we help nonprofits, one of the most frequent shortcomings we find with organizations that apply for and receive federal money without really getting ready to meet the requirements is that the accounting system isn't set up to make the reporting requirements easy or even adequate. Probably 70 or 80% of our clients use QuickBooks Online, and that's a great system for reporting. You can do everything you need to track reporting by funder, by program, even by location, and there are lots and lots of other parameters. But if you're not using your accounting system like QuickBooks to keep track of that level of detail, you may find yourself doing a lot of work in spreadsheets that not only is a lot of extra work, but is also very risky and can lead to a lot of incorrect numbers, especially if you're not checking back to compare the reports you're generating in Excel back to your accounting system to see if they match. Come audit time, whether it's a desk audit or a financial audit, one of the first things the auditors will do is compare the reports that you sent to the agency where you said, here's how much we spent during these last 3 months, and here's how much is left, and so forth. And if that doesn't tie to what's in your accounting system, then that's going to make them wonder whether you really have the ability to track that funding appropriately. Another weak spot for many organizations is that they simply don't read the entire award agreement that they receive. And even if they do, their eyes glaze over. It's full of legalese, and they may not understand the administrative requirements. That's not uncommon. A lot of agencies just really cloud the information in too many words. And if that's the case for you, call the agency. If you can't understand what the award document is asking, it's fair to call the agency, ask those questions, make sure you're on the same page, and that do I need to send in copies of all my canceled checks or all the expense receipts? Just what are they going to look for as you submit your claims for reimbursement and periodic reporting? The federal program officers are there to answer those questions, as are the finance officers. Although in current times, as we've all heard, many agencies have cut staff significantly. So if you can't reach your program officer, if you can't get the support you need on your federal awards, it's fair to reach out to your elected House or Senate representatives at the federal level. And I've been advised to recommend that you reach out both to their Washington, D.C. offices as well as their local district offices, where sometimes there's a smaller staff, but they may be able to give you more personalized help. And finally, a lot of groups read the administrative requirements, they understand them, but they feel like we don't really have to do that. It can be a huge administrative burden. One of the least popular and most frequently required administrative chores is to keep track of the time that your people are spending on these federal awards. The feds will pay their fair share, but only their fair share. And you need to be able to prove that what you're charging is what is for time that people actually spent on the award. So if you're not if you're not meeting those requirements at this point, I recommend you do everything you can to comply, even if you don't like it, even if you feel it's a huge culture shift. There is so much scrutiny now on not just nonprofits, but states, anyone receiving federal money, that, as my mother always said, it's time to get your ducks in a row and make sure you're fulfilling your timesheets, you're meeting those reporting requirements the way they expect it, when they expect it. And it might be uncomfortable, but if you want to keep the money coming in, it's certainly worth it.
Yeah, Hatsi, thank you for that. And what I'm hearing is just there's so many requirements needed, and definitely ways to do it right versus not right. We're going to kind of come back and underline some of those points you mentioned. But first, let's shift to our third polling question of the session. So we've been mentioning it and pointing to it, but we really like to know, has your organization, and to what extent has your organization been affected by the recent executive orders or perhaps other administrative actions that have canceled, maybe questioned, or put holds on some federal funding sources? And as the responses are coming through, I have seen some notes in the chat. Hatsi, you mentioned, calling the agencies, and we have had some people in here that can no longer call the agency since the contact people have been let go. So what might you say as a good, alternate in terms of that?
Well, to start with, be patient. If you're having trouble reaching your contacts at the federal agencies, give them time. They're under quite a bit of stress themselves, but they may also be great resources because they've got their ears to the ground close to the government, and they may be able to advise you on how to proceed. I haven't heard this very often, but I did just recently hear from a client who said that their federal funder, I'm not going to name names, advised them to pull money down in advance of need. I'm not telling you to do that, but if you hear that from your program or your finance officer, it might be something to consider. Most other agencies that are kind of betwixt and between, not knowing really how to react to the executive orders, especially in light of some of the legal decisions, are being cautious and conservative. So it's really up to the culture of your organization how you respond. If for instance the agency program officer advises you a certain way, I would recommend.
So you and I. So you and I talk about communicating with program officers at federal agencies all the time, and even in the best of times, we've found clients were reluctant to make those phone calls, worried they'd be seen as unworthy or making a mistake, or there'd be a black mark made next to their name. Program officers, in our experience, want to be helpful. They want you to receive a grant or a contract if you're an appropriate applicant, and they want to do everything possible to point you in the right direction and help you interpret the guidelines that we know can differ from agency to agency, even if the writing in Code of Federal Regulations is the same in both cases. What we're dealing with right now is challenging because you have to find that Goldilocks spot again. You need to be persistent and understand that if you've sent one email, your work is not done, right? You're going to have to stay on it, but you don't want to be a bother because the federal employees have been reduced in number. I know we needn't point that out to all of you today. They're under extraordinary pressure. They can't change or alter or decide not to comply with executive orders or OMB directives, but they still want to give you advice and assistance. And so reach out, be persistent, but be understanding. Don't be a pain. And as Hatsi said earlier, if you absolutely cannot reach them, there are no staff anymore, or you're not getting any responses, write to your elected representatives. But also keep copies of your attempts. Keep copies of your emails, of the letters you've sent. You may need to document later that you've tried to comply with the terms of your award, but weren't able to.
Exactly. You need to be able to document that diligence. And when you do, if and when you do get a chance to talk with the folks at the agency, be transparent. Tell it like it is. Don't, as Derek said, don't feel like it's a red flag to reach out with questions because, federal awards, the programming, the rules can be very complex. So it's fair to ask questions, and that's what they're there to help you answer. It's like we have some interesting poll results.
Absolutely. I'm in fact surprised to see most people have not yet been impacted. It was positive news for me, but it is pretty mixed around the board. So again, kind of reiterating a few of those things that both Hatsie and Derek have done such a good job explaining is I love the persistence yet patience and understanding. And what I'm hearing is just that, you know, these agency officers are humans too, and they you know, have their job and their work, and to support. And I'm sure most of them are also passionate about what they're trying to do as well, as just as the nonprofit is. So is there anything else that you guys want to kind of focus on in terms of do's and don'ts of managing funds and compliance?
Well, Carly, this is a summary of things we've already touched on: reading your award agreements, setting up your accounting system appropriately, and establishing and maintaining those good relationships. As you said, most of the people working in federal agencies believe in the mission of the agency, and they really want to help see the federal funding put to work in the way that the agency does their work. Reach out to them. Again, if you can't reach folks and you're coming up against a deadline of some sort, it's fair to reach out to your congressional representatives. What you don't want to do, as I've cited, is to do your accounting in spreadsheets. Use your accounting system. Set it up to do that for you. Don't ignore administrative requirements that you don't like. Don't let your accounting or filing fall behind. You may need to be able to pull a report overnight and respond to questions from the agencies. And by all means, don't miss reporting deadlines, because if there is a red flag in all this, that is a big red flag that usually raises questions that you really don't want to have to answer.
I want to share as well. Oh, go ahead, Derek.
Just going to say, Hatsie and I have always told our clients, you don't need to fear receiving a federal grant or award or contract. The thing to do is read everything very carefully and then set up the internal controls so that you can track what needs to be tracked and prove that you're complying with all of the aspects of it. Where we get scared is when maybe a new client comes on and tells us, oh, we're in year 2 of our federal grant. We say, great, can we see the report from year 1? What report? We didn't submit that. Oh, well, can we see the timesheets at least? What timesheets? And so on and so forth. It's easy to get in trouble by not paying attention to what may seem like little nitpicky details that don't matter, but they really do matter. So as Hatsie says, read everything carefully and stay on top of it. Track it in a proper system.
And to that point as well, is we mentioned YPTC is the nonprofit accounting experts, and we actually have another resource webinar that we did back in November called Nonprofit System Design. It's all about setting up your accounting system in order to be able to have easy outputs, just as Hatsie and Derek are noting. So all of that can be found on our YPTC website. So we have one final question prepared here, and it's really touching on a lot of the different things that we've covered so far. But to look at it more broadly, with shifting government budgets and policies, how can nonprofits stay informed and adapt to all of the changes that are happening in today's world?
Yeah, so again, Hatsie and I have done a lot of talks about how federal funding works in normal times, and we recognize and acknowledge these are not really normal times right now. Is the advice we would give different, though, Hatsie? I feel like there are actionable steps we can advise today's listeners to take in order to do the things that need to be done. And frankly, maybe the first one is take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. We're going to get through this. And you're not alone, but you're going to need to indulge in some self-care first.
Right. If you're not taking care of yourself, you can't take care of your stakeholders or any other aspect of the work that you're doing that you believe in. Stay informed. If you're here today, you are looking for information. We appreciate that. There are resources through the National Council of Nonprofits, which has state members as well. So if you go to the National Council's website, you can click on a map and find how to contact your state association. They all have newsletters and updates. And the National Council, I think, still has a survey open where they're looking for your stories of how the current environment might be impacting your nonprofit. As many of you probably know, they are front and center with some of the legal challenges to the executive orders, and they're using the stories that they're collecting to fight and make those challenges. But also stay in touch, as we've said, with your funders and other stakeholders, as well as your legislators. Your legislators need to hear directly from you as well. They're the ones making the decisions, and they need to hear how all this is impacting you. Derek talked a lot about diversifying income sources. Keep in mind that if you're getting money from state and local governments, that may be impacted. So as you look ahead, do some scenario planning. Think about, okay, what if nothing changes? Best case. What if we even get more money? Mid-range, what if we lose a little but not so much? And worst case, what if we were to lose all our federal funding and possibly even some of the state and local funding? So, and apply that not just to your income statement, but also to your cash. How is that going to impact cash flow coming up? Look ahead. I don't know, Derek, did I miss anything?
You know, that it always seems so painful and negative to talk about scenario planning, but there are a couple of things it can gain you. One is it gains you time, and time means ability to react. So if you learn that you might have a cash shortfall, but the cash will come in later, now you have time to organize a bridge loan or a line of credit. Maybe you discover you're going to lose a certain amount of funding, or a certain amount of funding is at risk. You could decide to spend less now, or you could decide to spend different. Maybe you want to invest in marketing or fundraising or other things. There's a lot of different ways to do scenario planning. It always seems, again, so negative, but it's not. It's really helpful. It's a way of ensuring you meet your strategic goals. And knowing that there's interest in that, YPTC wants to share its expertise in scenario planning as well. And Carly, I'm probably stealing your line here, but I'm pretty sure we're offering a webinar next month on scenario planning specifically. So for those of you ready to dive into that, we commend you, and we're here to help.
Good point, Derek. It won't be next month. However, it will be later on in this year, likely May. I am going to advance into the next and final poll question, kind of along that same line, is what type of content would you like more of on this topic? So go ahead and let us know what you'd like to see more of. Maybe it's all of the above. And if you have any specific topics, feel free to drop it in the Q&A, and we'd love to take that into consideration. I do want to say as well, if you were having any issues with the poll questions, do not worry. Please just reach out to cpe@yptc.com after today's session, and we will be able to help you. And Derek and Hatsi, as we wrap up, one more thing I actually wanted to mention is a lot of great resources have been shared throughout the time of today's webinar. And know that there are 2 slides at the end of this PDF document that you can download. And it's full of amazing links, including the National Council of Nonprofits that was mentioned, and grants.gov, sam.gov. So go ahead and check that out as well. But as we kind of conclude, Derek and Hatsi, any final words to the listeners that you would like them to carry away?
I just want to add again quickly, the National Council of Nonprofits, which we've mentioned several times, keeps coming up in the questions right now. People not sure what it is. We can't recommend it enough. You can get information on how executive orders are impacting nonprofits. So instead of endless doom scrolling, get precise, relevant information. Fill out the survey to talk about the impact executive orders are having on your organization. There are FAQs you can read. There's even a guide what to do if your grant or contract has been canceled or paused. And finally, there are links to the state organizations. So going back to that earlier theme, you're not alone. Reach out to the National Council of Nonprofits. You can get a lot of other resources there.
Right, including, I saw one question, how do I start a nonprofit? No better place to look than the National Council or its state member. Every state's nonprofit laws are a little bit different, so I'd advise you to, connect with your state's representative with the National Council, and you'll learn a lot. There are a lot of resources up there.
All right, and it looks like a lot of people want to see more webinars and also all of the above. So go ahead and register for next month's webinar. It's all about NICRA and negotiating that indirect cost rate. Hatsie's going to join us again, and we thank you so much for being here, for your engagement, for your time, and we hope you have an amazing rest of your day.